2026. This means that on average, the prices of goods and services increased by 6.2% between August 2025 and August 2026. You will note that from February 2026 to date, the inflation has consistently remained in the government target band of 6 to 8%. In terms of the annual food inflation, this declined to 6% from 6.4% in July 2026. This is mainly attributed to price movements in cereals, that is breakfast miller meal, roller miller meal, maize, grain, rice, among others, as well as sugar, cooking oil, and dried beans. The annual non-food also declined to 6.6% from 6.7% in July 2026. This is mainly attributed to price movements in fuels, lubricants, and purchases of vehicles. With regards to the monthly inflation for August 2026, this is recorded at 0.2%. This is the same that was recorded in July 2026, so there's been no movement in the monthly inflation. Moving on to the monthly food inflation and non-food inflation, there was a slight increase to 0.6% in the monthly food inflation from 0.1% recorded in July 2026, mainly attributed to price movement in fruits, fresh milk, vegetables, and eggs. In contrast, we had a decline in the monthly non-food inflation from 0.2% from 0.3% in July 2026, mainly attributed to price movement in pharmaceutical products, which include penicillin, aspirin, and items, among others, as well as price movements in fuels and lubricants. We will move on to the annual inflation by the various divisions. Inflation rate for August 2026 decreased for the following divisions. Food and non-alcoholic beverages declined to 6% in August 2026 from 6.4%. And for the alcoholic beverages and tobacco, the decline was from 7.8% in July 2026 to 7.7% in August. Housing, water, electricity, gas also declined to 7.7% from 7.9%. Then we also had declines in transport, communication, restaurant, and hotel. For the following divisions, we experienced an increase in the inflation for clothing and footwear from 6.6% to 6.7% in August 2026. For furnishing, household equipment, and routine household maintenance, there was an increase to 5.8% from 5.7%, while health increased to 9% from 8.9%. And inflation remained the same for the following divisions: recreation and culture, education, as well as miscellaneous goods and services. Moving on to inflation by province. With the exception of Lusaka province, which recorded the highest annual inflation of 8.3%, the rest of the provinces had annual inflation below the national average, with Wapula province recording the lowest inflation at 4.3%. In terms of the developments between July and August 2026, all the provinces, with the exception of Wapula and Northern, experienced a decline in inflation. For Wapula, the increase in inflation was from 3.9% to 4.3%, while Northern, the inflation increased to 5.7% from 5.5%. I will now move on to the second segment of the dissemination, which is the international measured as trade, which we report with a month lag. So the total cumulative trade for July 2026 was recorded at 359.2 billion kwacha from 377 billion kwacha, representing a decline of 4.8%. Zambia recorded a trade surplus in July 2026 of 4.1 billion kwacha, and to notice that the export earnings increased by 0.1%. This is attributed to increases in raw materials at 18.2%, capital goods increased by 56.2%, while consumer goods increased by 7.2%. The import earning bill increased by 0.4%, attributed to increases in intermediate goods at 9.5%, while the raw materials increased by 12%, and capital goods increased by 3.6%. In terms of the shares of traditional export earnings, as attributed earlier, there was an increase of 0.1%. The traditional export earnings, which are mainly copper, decreased in this period by 2.9%, from 20.4 billion in June to 19.8 billion in July. And just to say that in terms of the proportion of traditional export earnings, they account for 66.7%, which recorded a decline between June and July from 68.7%. In terms of the non-traditional export earnings, which are non-copper, there was an increase of 6.5% from 9.3 billion kwacha in June 2026 to 9.9 billion kwacha in July 2026. Focusing now on the share and value of bullion gold. As a composition of the non-traditional export earnings, it comprises of 2.1% in July 2026. And in terms of the earnings in July 2026, this was recorded at 207.2 million kwacha. Moving on to one of our main export earnings, which is copper, the traditional export earning. Between July 2025 and July 2026, it's been quite the pattern has been erratic. However, between June this year and July 2026, there was a decline in the export earnings of 4.5%, from 20 billion kwacha to 19.1 billion kwacha. Moving on in terms of the volumes of the export volumes, in terms of the cumulative volumes of refined copper, there was an increase of about 8.8% in July 2026, which is relative to the same period in 2025. However, between June 2026 and July 2026, there was a decrease in the export volumes of 7.9%. And also do track the prices of copper on the London Metal Exchange. Between June 2026 and July 2026, there was a decrease of 0.4% in the price of copper, from 13.6 thousand US dollars per metric ton to $13.5 thousand per metric ton in July 2026. Moving on to shares of the major non-traditional export earnings. We did talk about bullion gold, but now we focus on the agriculture non-traditional export earnings, these account for about 22.5% of all non-traditional export earnings, and this is a slight increase from 19.8 in June 2026. And we note that there was an increase in the earnings of 20.9% from 1.8 billion kwacha in June to 2.2 billion kwacha in July 2026. And some of the main exports are corn seed and other raw cane sugar. For the non-agriculture, non-traditional export earnings, these increased by 3% from 7.4 billion kwacha in 2026 to 7.7 billion kwacha in 2026, July 2026. We now focus on the shares of export by the major product categories. For Zambia, the main exports from intermediate goods are accounted for the highest share at 80.4. These include copper, cathodes, and so forth at 80.4%. So that was the highest share in July 2026. It was followed by raw materials at 12.2%. In terms of imports, by major product categories, similar to the exports, the intermediate good had the highest share at 42.7% in July 2026, followed by capital goods at 24.3%. We'll now move on to Zambia's major export markets, and we look at the selected regional groupings as well as major trade partners in June and July 2026. Canada and Asia recorded the highest export market for Zambian products in terms of the regional groupings at 34.8 and 28.9% respectively in July 2026. In terms of the import market shares by selected regional groupings, Asia and SADC exclusive recorded the highest import market shares for Zambia in July 2026 at 48.5% and 28.9% respectively. We also look at the trade balance by selected regional groupings. You'll note that Zambia there was a positive trade balance for dual SADC and COMESA. This means that Zambia was a net exporter to the dual SADC and COMESA exclusive regional groupings in July, and accounting for a trade balance, trade surplus, of 3.6 billion for dual SADC and COMESA, and 0.1 for the COMESA groupings respectively. Then we note that there was trade deficits for the rest, and particularly for Asia and SADC exclusive, meaning that Zambia was a net importer from Asia, accounting for 3.8 billion, while for SADC exclusive, the balance was, the trade deficit was 5.5 billion, while the European Union recorded a deficit of 1.4 billion kwacha. Having come to the end of the main statistical highlights, we'll just like to inform you that we'll be carrying out a major statistical activity called the 2026 Annual Enterprise Survey, and the fieldwork begins in early September. Just to give a bit of context to this, this is one of the major activities in our process. We have embarked on the GDP embracing process. If you do recall, we did have the economic enterprise census last year, and we concluded that. We also had a comprehensive stakeholder engagement with key stakeholders to ensure that we have a comprehensive statistical business register. And now we have embarked on the 2026 Annual Enterprise Survey. So we will have people field staff who will be coming to businesses. So we do appeal to you who are responsive public, particularly the businesses, to please avail our enumerators the required information. It's very important.